Welcome back, everyone. We're now keeping right on schedule for the second session today. So just to remind all of you, session 2 is on the topic of writing and publishing your research. And just as we had the two best experts in PhD research with Jonathan and Mary, you couldn't ask for two better experts in the area of publishing on research, given their expertise and experience with journals. So let me first introduce Professor Mikey Dunn, who is Associate Professor at the University of Oxford in the Nuffield Department of Population Health. Mikey is working on the ethics in healthcare, social care, and research, and his current research interests focus predominantly on various ethical aspects of community-based and long-term care practice, policy, and law in the UK and internationally. And in his research, Mikey draws upon and seeks to integrate philosophical, social, scientific, and legal methods of analysis. And he's got a lot of experience in publishing, and I think he might perhaps talk about his experience with the Journal of Medical Ethics. We're also delighted to have Professor Sara Fovargue at the University of Lancaster, or Lancaster University Law School rather. And Sara's research interests lie in the broad fields of healthcare law and ethics and family law. And she's published on matters relating to developing and emergency biotechnologies, reproduction, consent and capacity, and risk and regulation. And Sara has past experience being associate editor of BMC Medical Ethics, and she's currently co-editor-in-chief of Medical Law Review, published by Oxford University Press. So we are delighted to have both Mikey and Sara with us today, and I'll turn it over to both of them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ted, and welcome everybody. Thanks for the introductions. Good to have you all on the call. I'm going to start us off, and I'm going to share my screen, and we'll talk you very briefly through what we're going to plan for this session. Bear with me for a minute. I think I might just have it like that, if that's okay for people, just because I can better control my screen if I do that. Is that okay? Can everybody see that?
That's great, Mikey.
Okay, excellent, thanks. So we're talking to the topic of writing and publishing your research, and we hope this will be a topic of interest to everybody, depending on, regardless of their career stage. So maybe you're in the first few months of your PhDs and starting to think about the writing demands that might come with submitting your PhD in terms of published papers that go alongside that later in your research project. Maybe you're in your later stage of your PhD where you're starting to think about actually writing your first paper, maybe your second or third papers. Or maybe you're an early career researcher, postdoc, who's trying to build up a body of published work. So we're going to hopefully offer something to everybody in those situations. And our topic here is both the process of writing research in bioethics and health law, but also the activity of publishing and how we might interact with editors and that process as well. So here's our approach in the session today. And I'll hand over to Sara in a moment to talk about the plan in terms of what we'll actually cover. We want to walk you through the entire writing process. So we're going to do it in 4 steps. And we're going to do so from both our perspective as people who have written papers and published papers in bioethics and health law, but also as people with experience in editorial roles for some of the journals in the field, at least. When we sat down together to sort of work out how to best deliver this session, we identified a kind of immediate challenge, I think. So we thought, well, either we could make this heavily individualized, we could give you very focused guidance on what you need yourself for your particular papers that you might be writing, which of course is completely infeasible in a setting like this, or we could give sort of overarching guidance, something about what it means to write well, that's largely going to be quite trite, I think, in content terms, and it's probably the kind of thing you've heard many times before. So what we decided to do instead, and also quite similar to what John and Mary did in the previous session, is have an informal conversation together about this, and essentially for Sara and I to confess our own experiences and insights as part of working through the process of writing and editing journals that we invite you to listen into, but also to contribute to in the end as well. And our starting point was this: what are the kind of things about writing and publishing would we have liked to have known or been told about when we were in your shoes, essentially? What kind of little tidbits of information could have been useful? The insider track, perhaps, that comes with having experience in going through writing and going through publishing. Now, similar to the last speakers, a bit of a proviso, we are here speaking confessionally from our personal experiences, and we are not at all presuming this advice is generalizable. That's, I think, partly because the reality of writing itself is a deeply personal activity. People will write in very different ways. Sara and I write in very different ways, I'm sure, and we will only give our own perspectives on the things that work for us or the challenges we've encountered and how we've dealt with them. I think when it comes to our sharing of some experiences about working with journals, it's also really important to note that the advice here that we give is not taken to encapsulate any formal or informal policies that specific journals have, nor do we take it to be common to other people who might take on an editorial role. So we're giving much more general insight that is very personal in character. Just to get us going, we thought we'd open up with a question for you. And what we're interested in you thinking about, and what we hope to touch on in our presentation, is what would you like to know, or what worries do you have about the process of writing or publishing papers in bioethics and medical law? So in the next couple of minutes or so, if there's anything particular you'd like to hear about, or specific concerns you want us to address, do note them down in the chat box, and we'll try and pick those up as we go in our conversation, or at the very least, we'll pick them up in the Q&A at the end. Great, Sara, over to you.
Okay, so as Mikey said, we're going to sort of take a four-stage approach to what we thought we'd talk about today. Very broad. We thought we'd spend perhaps 10 minutes talking about the writing context. So how do you decide what to write? We'll then move on to sort of thoughts about the writing process. How do you actually go about writing?
Then thinking about, finish? Can't do it.
Sorry, then thinking about the submission process. So what goes through your mind when you're thinking about submitting your paper to a journal? And then we'll talk sort of as writers, but also then we'll talk a little bit about editors. So what might editors be looking for? And then we'll move on to talk about the outcome then. So how do you deal with the outcome of your submission? And as I say, we're sort of thinking about 10 minutes or so on each section, but obviously matters overlap. But we thought if we broke them down in this way, at least give some structure to our conversation. But as Mikey said, we're very, very keen for you to put your questions or your thoughts, your comments in the chat box, because obviously we want to offer you as much help and support and guidance as we can. We've tried to think, as Mikey said, what would we like to know? But, well, for me in particular, it's been a while since I was in that position as a PhD student or an early career researcher, so it's hard to know exactly what people would like, but we're hoping that we've covered some of the points that might be of interest to you. So
great, thanks, Sara. So I think I'm starting off on it by asking you the first question.
You are indeed.
So we're starting with the writing context, and what I'd like to ask you is, how do you decide what to write?
Okay, so when I was thinking about this, I thought it might be useful for me to think about how I decide what to write in relation to 3 papers. So a paper, or my most recent solo paper that's been accepted for publication, so sort of the past. Then I thought I might say a little bit about a paper that I've just started writing, so the present, and then a paper that I want to write, so the future. And so I'll sort of refer to these throughout our 4 sections. So when thinking about the past paper, so the most recent solo paper that's been accepted, this paper came about because I was asked to make a presentation about best interests and pregnant women at a workshop. And I was asked to do this because I'd looked at matters about pregnancy before, particularly a series of cases about authorising caesarean sections without the pregnant person's consent. But at that point, I hadn't really thought about pregnancy and best interests as such. So as I say, then this past paper sort of came about through this invitation. I'm going to then move on to the present paper, and the present paper that I'm working on, and literally I've only just started working on it last week, is an empirical write-up of a research project that I've been working on with Mary Neal, looking at conscientious objection and pharmacists. So in a way, I've almost got no choice but to write this this paper, this report, because it's funded research, so I have to deliver something. So I sort of was thinking about the past and the present paper together, because I was sort of thinking that in a way it feels as if the decision on what to write was almost made by somebody else or something else, and that the control or the decision in a way wasn't really mine. But of course that's not really true, because with the past paper I could have said, oh, I don't want to go and deliver at this workshop, particularly, as I say, because I hadn't really thought about the matter at hand. But actually it was an opportunity that I didn't want to miss. So in a way then I decided what to write because I was given an opportunity and I decided to go for it. And then with the present paper, well, I could not have applied for funding, because obviously I knew that as part of funding, you're more likely than not going to be asked to write something. But again, this was something that, or is something that I'm really interested in and curious about. And so I wanted to go ahead. So whilst I could say that they weren't decisions that I made, obviously the writing came about through other decisions that I made earlier in the process. And then thinking about a future paper, well, I have, and I've always have a number of ideas which sort of sit on the back burner, and I think about over a number of years. And I get the ideas for these from reading the work of others or listening to people at conferences where people either say or write something that I either don't disagree with or I don't understand. And it makes me start to think, and then I go on to do some research around it. Or I get ideas from legal cases. Again, this most often are decisions that I don't agree with, or it's a comment from a judge that interests or irritates me, even if I agree with the decision. So I guess then you could say that for lawyers, it can be easier for us to think about or find something to write about, because cases are decided all the time. So as I say, we really should have no shortage of material. But then I think that alongside those sorts of things that might start you off writing, I think that research comes in here as well with the thinking about or deciding what to write, because you need to see if your ideas are viable, if they make sense, if they're new, are they original, what are you adding? And here I think that law's different to some other disciplines, at least in that we don't tend to do literature searches or reviews in a structured way as happens in other disciplines. But I actually am starting to think that I need now to be doing more structured literature reviews, because I'm working more and more with colleagues from other disciplines, and I see how much they benefit from doing sort of structured reviews. But when I'm thinking about, I've got this idea about, I've heard somebody say something at a conference that I'm interested in, and I'm thinking, well, I wonder if I could do anything with that. And I'm then thinking, well, where do I go to find out? Actually, I very often go to a textbook, because I look then to see, or to make sure that I've got a good grounding in or a correct understanding of the law. But also textbooks can be useful because they'll have footnotes and references, further reading, so you can start to sort of look at what is out there. And I almost see it as sort of following a trail. So I'll then go and have a look at the references, the wider reading, and then they'll refer you on to other matters. And if you follow the trail far enough, then you start to get referred back to material that you've already read. So you almost start to feel that you've covered the main commentators or the main ideas in the field. And so that's what I sort of did with both the past paper and the current paper. With the future papers, where I'm thinking about things to write and I've got ideas, I collect things as I go. So because I'm generally think I'm interested in 3 particular areas, for example, I'll be looking out for them. What are people publishing? And then when I've got time, I'll start then to do a sort of a more thorough review. So I think really what I want to say is that be open to, ideas can come, I think, from anywhere, and be open to that possibility that you can get an idea while listening to somebody else talk about. It could be a particular matter you're interested in, or it could be about something else completely different. And then try to read widely and across disciplines where relevant. I also talk to anybody I can who'll listen to my ideas about what I'm doing or what I'm thinking of doing, because very often they may know material that might be of interest to me, or they can see links that I can't. So I sort of do that as well. So Mikey, I've rambled on long enough. I think I don't have a clock, so I'm not sure how long that was, but over to you now for you to think about then how you decide what to write.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I mean, I think I completely agree with the points you're making there. And I think it's really important for people working in bioethics that idea of reading across disciplines is something people have in mind, because I think there are ideas and there are going to be arguments hidden away in different disciplinary contexts that people need to be aware of. I mean, so as a bioethicist writing papers, I think there's a sort of broad set of two types of motivation that shape my writing. Some of that is about the personal academic commitments I have, and some of it is about the disciplinary and institutional context in which I'm required to write, or which I'm basing my writing. So I think, on the personal side, there's a kind of strategic dimension to some of the things I decide to write. So I want to have a series of papers that I'm constantly working on that are core to my research interest, and I'm always sort of keeping a bit of an eye on. So that's partly, I think, about thinking about broader career development and academic identity formation kinds of goals. And I see Rachel's written a comment in the chat about the idea of publishing during the PhD. I think strategically, this is kind of an important point, because yes, okay, for your Viva, having published papers might make it more straightforward to defend some of your ideas to your examiners. But I think the real benefit of publishing early and doing it quite strategically is that you become visible in the field. And when you're thinking about getting a first step on the career ladder, it's really important that people get to know what you're known for and how you might make your name. And I think that's one of the strong rationale for me for publishing during your PhD, and to continue that as you develop your career. This is the thing that you're known for. And so I'll always have a sense of some papers or ideas that I want to be managing, because I want those to continue. And then I'll have a set of sort of other kinds of papers which kind of come out of the blue, really, often motivated, like you, Sara, to prepare a response to something else that I've read. So if I read something that's on a topic of interest to me, I might just get a spark. There's something wrong with one of the arguments that's just been made in the published literature, and I want to respond to that. And that can be formal through something like the American Journal of Bioethics publishing its target articles and calling for commentaries, but more commonly just on the basis of something I've read and I want to be part of that debate. But I think beyond these sort of personal academic and career considerations, it's really important to reflect also on the disciplinary and institutional factors that shape what I decide to write, and that can often act as constraints on what I personally like to be spending my time on as a writer. And there's a lot to say about this, and a lot to be critical of, I think, in contemporary academia. But it is true that our writing outputs, as we move into early career roles like postdocs and beyond, that the writing outputs that we produce are a significant way in which we're going to be judged to be of value by our employers. So that's formalized partly through the ref process. And it would be wrong to say I don't have to keep an eye on that when I'm thinking about what to write and where to publish. But beyond that, I think there are also disciplinary expectations and institutional expectations that shape those decisions. And I think it's particularly important for people in bioethics, because they can be employed in different disciplinary homes, in law faculties, in philosophy faculties, in medical schools, etc. And they're going to place different demands and expectations on you. So if you're thinking about finding a particular home, a place you want to work, a base in which your career will develop, so if you see yourself as the kind of bioethicist who wants to teach or research in a medical school, it's really important that you make decisions about what that home might expect of you in advance, I think. So I work in a medical environment, I work in a population health department, and there are some expectations from my senior colleagues in that department that come along with that. People publish a lot, the scientists publish a lot, 10 to 15 papers a year. So if I'm only publishing 1 or 2 papers, that's not going to look good, and I'm going to get judged negatively, regardless of the fact that I'm coming from a different disciplinary stance. My chance of career progression is going to be reduced, I think, then. So I need to think about ways to work across a broad range of projects to maximize the chance of obtaining higher numbers of publications, working with others to make that more realistic. That's all kind of strategies I have to think about, I think, here. People also publish multi-authored papers in the environment in which I work. It's really rare to publish something by yourself. And indeed, people look at solo authored publications, I think, in my department with some degree of suspicion, a kind of unscientific polemic or something like that. But of course, if you're working in a law school or philosophy faculty, that will be completely opposite. So it's very important to be aware of that. Books, also, a very strange concept in medical faculties. Senior colleague of mine announced to one of the scientists in the department he's going to write a book on this particular topic, and is basically told, why on earth would you waste your time doing that? Write papers. So yeah, that's going to be very different depending on your disciplinary home and where you see yourself moving, I think, in the future. So we better move on because we're up to 11 or 12 minutes on that one, Sara.
Well, I was just going to say, I think those really interesting points then about becoming visible, about demands and expectations, particularly your point about the medical school. I've heard lots of people make that, and those comments about, yeah, multi-authored papers and books, and this idea of sole-authored piece being sort of approached or judged as suspicious or with suspicion makes me laugh. But anyway, yeah. Let's move on then to talk about the writing process then. So how do you actually go about writing?
So I think this is the biggie, isn't it, really? How on earth do you go from an initial germ of an idea for a paper or a book to the polished final product? And there isn't a single way, I don't think, to travel to that final destination. It's going to depend on what you're writing, your personality as a writer, who you're writing with and their personalities as writers, and where you ultimately want to get to, what the product is, I think. I mean, partly reflecting what I've just said, about 90% of my papers have been co-authored. I very rarely write by myself. And I have some sleepless nights about that at times, I have to say. But I want to focus my reflections on multi-authored writing. I think I've got particular experience on that point. I think the writing process importantly differs when you're writing with others. And for me, there's two steps here: the initial formulation of your ideas and the process of drafting the manuscript. So in a co-written paper, the idea for the paper is going to come from many different places, I think. So looking at my co-author publications from 2020, there were 9 co-authored publications. 3 came out of ethics support work in an ethics committee that I sit on during the pandemic, addressing specific issues, ethical issues that came out of our work on that committee that gave rise to more generalizable claims, co-authored with other members of the committee. 3 came from academic workshops, one I did in the UK, one in the USA, one in Hong Kong, where the attendees and the organizers of those events decided to write something on the basis of what was talked about at those meetings. And the other 3 just came from coffee or drink in the pub with colleagues or friends or students. Some new people, some people I've written with extensively before, just the off chance meeting that gave rise to the germ of an idea that became a paper. So when it comes to the process of drafting co-authored papers, I think the first thing you've got to get really clear about is the division of labor. So who is going to lead and who is going to contribute and how is that going to work? Are you going to redraft a relatively complete draft that's put forward by the lead author? Are you going to write different sections of the paper? And just as importantly in making that decision, is that division of labor fair? Are people being treated fairly in the workload being allocated? It isn't uncommon, I've seen this before, people to dump the grunt work of the first draft on the most junior colleague because they're the least busy person, as it might go. You might challenge that, but that's certainly sometimes how it's put. Is everybody happy with the arrangements that are in place? Can people speak up if they're not happy? It's very important to set those ground rules, I think, when you're writing together. And it's also helpful at that point to get clear, I think, on authorship and how those conventions are going to apply in the writing project. And I'll come back to some of those points as I go on. I think it's also helpful at that point to get some sense about what the destination of the paper might be. I don't think it's necessarily important to determine that finally, but you might have 2 or 3 possible destinations in mind. I don't know if Sara will agree with this, but I think it's better to think about saying what you want to say first, and rather than saying something for a particular future potential home for it. But there's some discussion to have about that, I think. Now, if I'm the lead author, I think I'll generally fall back on my own personal approach to writing papers. So when I'm writing a bioethics paper, my first aim is this: what is the claim I'm going to make? I want to start with that conclusion. And I do that usually before I even engage with the literature or do much further research, especially if it's an area that I'm quite familiar with. Then I'll move to the argument that underpins that claim. I'm going to make the argument now to support the conclusion. And that's where a deep dive into the literature is going to be really, really important. So what are the weaknesses with published arguments on this topic? Are there any other arguments on this topic? Has it been made? Can you only say the same thing that someone else has said, in which case that might be the end of the road for the paper, of course. So I also personally, this is my own strategy, write a paper entirely in my head before I sit down and put it on paper or on a laptop screen. And that can take me weeks or months or years. I've got solo papers that I've been brewing in my head for 7 or 8 years. And I just don't feel I can nail the argument, so I'm not ready to write it. But of course, when you're co-writing, you've got responsibilities to other authors. So it's really important that you're realistic about what the time frame is going to be and that people are updated about that, I think. But because the paper, when I write, is essentially already written in my head, when I'm ready to write, it only takes me about a week or so to actually draft it. And it's very important for me, that's protected time. And that's rare to get protected time because you're caught up with other duties around teaching and administration and such like. But you do need, I think, protected time to write the first draft of a paper. If I'm not the lead author of the paper, but I'm one of the contributors, I think the key issue for me is managing my investment carefully and appropriately and respectfully of the lead author. I think a general rule that I find helpful to follow in co-author publications is it's the lead author's paper, first and foremost, and you are contributing to that lead author's piece of work. Now, if you end up disagreeing with the argument that the lead author makes, it's really important in advance, I think, to have clarified how you might deal with that. Now, of course, that's uncommon because you're writing together for a reason. But it can happen, and I can think of 2 examples in the last 2 years where I've had to withdraw from being an author on the paper just because I couldn't get on board with the argument that the lead author wanted to make. On another occasion, I remember the entire writing group splintered into 2. We decided to write 2 entirely separate papers making completely opposite claims on the basis that we couldn't agree and that we would have to say something different alongside each other. So, Sara, I'll hand over to you now to talk about your experiences of writing.
Well, it was a really good job that I was muted, because when you said that it takes you about a week to write, I laughed out loud, because in the paper, what I called my past paper, that actually took me 4 years to write. It's not that I was sitting down every day for 4 years and writing it, but it took me, I knew, so that was the paper that came from the conference or the invitation to talk about best interests and pregnancy. And once I'd started thinking about it, I then decided I wanted to write about it. But I just couldn't decide. I knew what I wanted to say, but I just couldn't decide how to get there. So I struggled, and it really was for 4 years that it took me to write it. So. And that was, even though I'd gone through my process, and my process is planning, and I do, and this is, I think, where we do differ a little bit, is that I do often at the start think about, where do I want this to be published? And that's because I think in law, it can make a particular difference whether you want to go for a general law journal or whether you want to go for a specialist law journal. So it's thinking then about your audience. And so that's why, as I say, I sort of look to think about that at the start. And there is no right or wrong there. It will depend on your paper. Also, do you want to go for a national journal or an international journal? And all these matters, I will talk to other people about it. So just as I'm talking about my ideas, I will also say, well, I'm thinking about writing on this, and I'm thinking of submitting it here, not that it's even written at this point, but what do you think about it? I try to sort of canvass people's opinions. So I plan in terms of where I want to publish, and then I start planning in terms of my ideas. So knowing what my argument is and how I'm going to make it, the saying something new, but all the time reviewing my plans as I'm actually doing the writing. So I think that's where Mikey and I are quite similar in some respects. And also what can a sort of impact in terms of planning and the sort of the process of writing is, do you have a timescale? So do you have a deadline as to when you have to have something done by? So if you're writing, if you're invited to submit a chapter in a edited collection, for example, you'll have a deadline. So that will obviously then be spurring you on and be thinking about your planning. Otherwise, do you want to set yourself a deadline? And that in a way was one of my issues with the past paper that I was talking about, in that I had no real driver in terms of time, because I didn't have any necessary reason to get this out by a particular date. which was good in a way because it meant it gave me time and space to really think through my ideas. But that is, as I said, the bit that took the longest. I also think in the process of writing, and I talked a bit before about research, I also think about when have I read enough? And I think that's really hard to say, and it will depend on the area that you're looking at. Obviously, if it's a well-researched area, there'll be a lot more material available. And that can mean that it's easier to identify the key pieces that you need to read. But if you're looking at an area that isn't a well-trodden path in a way, then there's more scope for you to decide for yourself what it is that you need to read to help you make and support your own argument. So, and when you're doing your reading, that's when I sort of look for gaps, you know, what is it that we don't know, or what new perspective can you offer on what we already do know? And it all comes back to originality. And I was thinking also with the writing process about how long does writing take? Well, you know, Mikey writes his in his head and then takes a week to write. I can take 4 years to write. So it is one of those where it's like, how long is a piece of string? It will depend on the length of the piece. So very often in law, pieces can be 10,000, 12,000 words. I think in bioethics, in a lot of the bioethics journals, they tend to be shorter pieces in my experience. So perhaps that will affect how long it takes. But all the time, reflect on and review what you have written. Self-edit, be ruthless. Do you make your argument? Do you support it? Is it persuasive? And as I've said a number of times, I really do think that talking to others about what you're writing can help with all of this. So share your thinking and ideas with trusted others, and not just people who will agree with you. You want to sort of go almost to critics, to people who will not agree with you, so that you are challenged and you are pushed. That's how you get your ideas and your thoughts tested. So I think that's all I really want to add to your comments on the writing process, Mikey.
Great, thanks, Sara. I should say that these papers being written in my head can also take 7 or 8 years to write. They just don't go on paper until I decide they're ready to do so. So we might have some similarities there, I guess, just different locations by which the time is being spent.
Oh, I've just decided you're a whiz now for me at writing, and I'll always be in that way.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure that's quite true. Okay, so we're moving on to the submission process now. And I see some messages in the chat, which are important points about managing time during a PhD, thinking about PhD writing and journal writing. Well, we might come back to those in the Q&A perhaps. But what we want to think a bit about now is the process of submitting the paper to a journal. We're thinking about papers here and journals in particular. And we're going to take 2 questions, one from the standpoint of the writer and one from the standpoint of our experienced editors. So what comes to mind, Sara, for you when you're thinking about submitting your paper to a journal, and in reverse, what might the editor be looking for when that paper is submitted?
Yeah, so I'll think about it as a writer, first of all. And I was thinking then, how do you know when your paper is ready for submission? I was sort of thinking of it in that way. And part of it, I think, is sort of, it's almost knowing yourself, knowing when you think your argument is ready for others to read and to see and to think about. But when I think I'm done, this has been my experience, I often think I'm done, and then I share my draft with somebody else. And they will almost always see holes in my argument or matters that I need to address, or it could be other material that they think I need to read. And so I found that, or often find that, quite downheartening in a way, that I think that I'm done, then I'm told that I'm not done. But I think that that's because when you're really close to something and you've spent so much time on it, when you've been thinking about it for so long, you've been planning, you've been researching, and you've done the writing, that you just become too close and you can't see the gaps. So I think that when you think you're done and ready to submit, I think it's absolutely essential that at that point you get feedback from other people before you actually submit it to a journal. And so I guess if you are working to some form of time scale or deadline for yourself, I would definitely build that into your thinking, because I honestly think that you need to road test your ideas. As I sort of mentioned before, it'll help you to head off your critics. You want to be challenged by colleagues inside and outside your institution. Go to the leaders in your field, actively seek them out, ask them if they would look at your paper. I've done that. I've done that at all stages of my career, and 9 times out of 10, I've had positive response. I've had people ask me to read their papers, and I've always happily done it if I've had the time. If I've not had the time, I've made it very clear as to that's why I've been unable to do it. Not that I'm sort of against it as a rule, but I will do my best to help people and read their work and offer comments before it goes out for a journal. Because if you can get those sorts of comments there and you persuade the people that are leading your field of your argument, then in a way you're almost one step ahead of the peer reviewers. And very often I will look at papers and see who's thanked at the bottom, and you'll see a long list of people, and in the strongest papers, many people are thanked because we know the benefit of going to other people and asking for their impact, asking for their help. And then obviously when you get those comments, respond positively to the comments from these people. Don't see it as a personal attack. You know, it's a comment on your view, on your argument, and not on you. And be open-minded. But that is really, really hard, I think, especially if you've spent so much time on it and you're convinced that you're done, and then you send it off to somebody and they come back with this, 3 pages of comments on it. And it can be the moment when I put my head on my desk and have a little sob. And I think it's only when you've done all that should you then submit to a journal. And then when you submit to the journal, make sure that you get your basics right. Know who your audience is. And that's obviously going to be linked to the journal that you're submitting to, which is why I always think of that fairly early on in the process. Make sure that you follow the style guidelines of the journal. Because just doing those basic things, they help you minimize the chances of your paper being returned or rejected without even making it to the peer review stage. So thinking about that past paper that I talked about, I tried out my ideas in 4 different universities at different stages of my thinking. And then right at the end, I gave it to 5 different people, again at different institutions, to have a look at, and all came back with different comments, but really, really helpful to make me think about it. It was really painful, but as I say, I think it made my paper stronger at the end, and that it helped me to say what I wanted to say. So I was wondering, Mikey, do you want to speak from the position of the writer before we move on to the editor bit? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sara. Absolutely. I completely agree with what you're saying. I think it's really important to endorse that. Your road testing ideas is so important, and there are different formal and informal ways of doing that. And of course, as PhD students in particular, you've got ready-made road testers available, your supervisors. They may even be your co-authors potentially, but if they're not, they're the ones who I think you would go to really help you to work out whether the paper is saying something new and important yet. And I think don't be afraid to ask those people you consult with, is the paper ready to be submitted? I think when it comes to publishing bioethics papers and thinking about submitting to bioethics journals, perhaps slightly differently to health law, there are a much wider range of options, I think, to choose from. And it's really important, I think, to recognize that those bioethics journals have different expectations and orientations that you might not be altogether that obvious. I mean, some of those are basic things like some are more or less geographically orientated. The JME is more UK focused. American Journal of Bioethics obviously is more American focused. So it doesn't make much sense if you're writing on a policy or legal or practice issue that's UK focused to be submitting to a job or the Monash Bioethics Review or something like that. Some journals, and this is important, I think, given the way the field is multidisciplinary, some journals are more philosophical in orientation and some are more empirical. There's a very interesting piece of research done by Tamsin Wangmo and colleagues in Switzerland recently, looking at the destinations of empirical research in bioethics. And they're showing generally that there's an increasing trend to publish more and more empirical papers, although they're still in the minority over philosophical type papers or theoretical papers. But interestingly, I think that struck me was that the vast majority of those papers are published in two journals, the Journal of Medical Ethics and Nursing Ethics. Now, I think there's also a BMC Medical Ethics that I'd draw attention to there, which is excluded from the Wangmo study. But those are three journals, when you look at them, they're clearly more orientated towards receiving empirical pieces of work. So it is important, I think, to attenuate your expectations to those sort of implicit orientations that I think are present in the journals. Sara, back to you from an editor's perspective.
Okay, so I said already about the importance of adhering to the journal style guidelines of wherever you're submitting. Also, if you ask for an abstract, the abstract does so much work for you. It is the thing that grabs the reader's attention when it's published, but the editor's attention straight away. So you need to be able to encapsulate in 200 words or whatever why it is absolutely critical that this paper is published at this time and that it needs to be read at this time. So you really need to sort of hone what you're going to say in there, distill your argument into those 200 words or whatever it is. I just thought, because obviously now as one of the editors-in-chief of the Medical Law Review, I thought I'd just really briefly just talk about our process, just to set, because I think many journals, at least law journals, have a similar type of process. So I'll just go through it really quickly. So a paper is submitted to us. It will be checked by somebody in our editorial office to see that all the documents and information that we need has been provided. So things around affiliations, a cover letter, that the paper is sufficiently anonymised, particularly if there's references to already published work within it. And then once it's passed all those checks, it will then either come to myself or Jose Miola, who's the other editor-in-chief. And then we're asked to decide whether or not to send it out for peer review. So one of our options is that we can desk reject. So we can decide that this should not go out for peer review. And that might be because it doesn't really fall within the remit of the journal, or there could be issues with English, or the paper could be too short, or it could be too long. And if we decide to desk reject a submission, then we'll always give some brief comments as to why we've done that. And particularly if we can see that the author is a postgraduate researcher or an early career researcher. So we will always go to try to check as much as we can who the author is and give information to help them where possible. If we decide to send it out to two peer reviewers, they have about 10 weeks or so to review and possible decisions. So they can say that we should accept it. They can say that we should accept but minor revisions are needed. They say that we should accept but major revisions are needed, or revise and resubmit, which there isn't a guarantee publication there, but we're saying there's the essence of a good argument here, but more work is done, so we encourage you to come back to us, or it'll be a straightforward reject. And then those responses from the two reviewers will come back to us, and then when we will make our decision based on those options. So that was just a quick run through. So Mikey, what do you want to add?
Thanks, Sara. Yeah, I mean, I think those are really, really helpful points. I mean, there's just a sort of few general observations I think I'd make about editing journals and what perhaps authors aren't always clear about, particularly in the early stages of their career. I mean, the first one for me is that the editors hold all the cards, that they are the people who make the decisions. It's not the peer reviewers. The peer reviewers guide the decision, but the editors decide. And they will have to desk reject a significant number of papers because there's so many more submissions than publishable spaces in the journal. So it's not impossible that the editors might get peer reviews back that are positive and read positively, but still reject the paper for priority reasons, or because it's just not as positive or as important in their view as the other papers that they're managing. And that's going to be difficult for an author to understand, but it is important that the peer reviewers just guide that decision-making process. They don't determine it. And so the editors do have quite a significant amount of power in that sense. I mean, they're also really busy people. Some of them may be managing up to 50 submissions a month, full papers that they have to make decisions about and manage through that process. Unfortunately, your paper is not going to be as important to them as it is to you, and they're not doing this as a full-time job. So you do have to present everything in a way that can enable them to make a decision that they'll have to make quite quickly in their spare time around all of their other roles. And I think that's absolutely right, Sara. The abstract is critical in that decision. Much more important to me, I think, than the cover letter. Focus on the abstract. It's got to be clear from the abstract what the claim is and what the argument is, how novel it is, what it's doing, what it's saying. An editor might well come to an initial decision about whether to guess reject or not just by reading the abstract. Of course, they're going to go on to read the rest of the paper, but they're going to get an initial sense of whether to proceed from the quality of the abstract, I think, quite often.
Yeah, can I just say, I probably shouldn't say this, but I rarely read the cover letter. But I read the abstract, and yeah, it's almost like with undergraduate work, where within the first couple of paragraphs of an essay or an exam answer, you have a sense of how this is going to go ahead in terms of what grade you might award it. And it can be like that with the abstract. If the abstract grabs you, then you're more likely to go, well, I will always go on and read, but you will start to have a more favourable sense or positive outlook towards, and that's what you want. But can I just say, your point about paper isn't as important to the editors as it's important to it's spot on. You're absolutely right. We do this in our spare time. This is around the fringes of my work. It's not part of my university work to do this. So yeah, I'm just conscious of time, so we should really move on then, Mikey, to the outcome and how do you deal with the outcome of your submission. So what are your thoughts here, please?
Well, good, thanks. I'll do this quite briefly. I think it's perhaps the briefest topic area anyway. I mean, I think it depends on the outcome first and foremost, but the most important point to make here is to expect and respond positively to failure, it seems to me. I was trying to work this out looking at my published papers, and I think I worked out about 30% of them have been rejected in a different journal before being published in the final journal that they ended up in. So, rejection is a fact of life. If I looked at funding grant applications, it would be significantly higher than that. So, if you get a rejection, take it on the chin. I think, it's going to be difficult. Many of us, I think, given where we are in our careers and your backgrounds, the fact you're doing what you're doing now means you're going to have experienced a lot of academic success, I think, in the past. Rejection is something that people have to come to terms with in academic careers, I think, at every stage. I think it's really important. My general rule for myself is resubmit within the next month. I've got 3 papers. This is the kind of tragedy of my PhD time. 3 papers, so my first postdoc, 3 papers, which 25,000 words in total, which were rejected and are just sitting in my hard drive, never resubmitted. And it's way too late now because they're picking up on things that are just not at issue anymore. Can't resubmit them now. They clearly were publishable. And if I just spent a bit of time taking on board the comments, taking on board the criticism from the reviewers, I could have got those 3 papers published. So I set myself this rule now: resubmit within a month. Get further insights, use all of the information that the editors and the reviewers have given you to help you with that process, but get it resubmitted, take it on the chin, see it as a process of improving the work. And that's it's just part and parcel of the job, I think. If you get a major or minor revision decision, you're on the road to publication. Major revisions might require a lot of work, but you should take that as a really positive outcome because the editors decided that, yeah, this is going to be ultimately publishable work. And if you do what's expected of you, it will be published, I think. Editors don't expect you to do everything the reviewers say. They are very open to the idea that you will resist changing something on the basis of your academic judgment from the comments that have been made. What they will expect is a clear rationale for why you should ignore that suggestion or comment that the reviewer has made. So it's really important to carefully craft that response letter where you take point by point everything that the reviewers have said, and it's clear what you've done if you've changed something, and if you haven't changed something, it's also very clear why you can rationally defend that to the editors, and they'll be very responsive to that. I'm going to leave it there, Sara.
I just agree with you there, Mikey. Sorry to continue. Just say that that's absolutely right. The bit about absolutely engage with what with the comments from the reviewers and or the editors. We absolutely don't expect them to agree with absolutely everything, because as you say, it is academic, but we need to know that you have considered it, you have thought about it, you have heard what these people have said, because the reviewers will be experienced academics, if not the leaders of in your field. So why would you not listen to what they say? And yeah, failure, well to say, shouldn't see it as failure, but you will see it as failure when you have something rejected, and you will, and it does, and it hurts, and it will make you upset. I think I would give yourself a few days before you start looking at it, but I think Mikey's right, do not shelve it, because nothing that I've written that's been rejected has not then gone on to be published elsewhere. And I think there's only one piece of work which I was happening to write with somebody else. We never actually got to submission process, that I've put to one side, but you sort of feel resentful to the fact that I spent time on something and then didn't go ahead and carry on through it. So it is, see it through. You've worked on it, there is something there. If you've done all the bit beforehand, all the thinking, the planning, the writing, the road testing, then it just means that for this journal, it isn't right at this time, but you've got comments, read them carefully, think about them, respond to them, get up and get on with it and get it in elsewhere, and it will be published. So I think we're overrun. Sorry, Anne-Marie and Ted. I think we're more or less done though, aren't we, Mikey?
I think we are, yeah. Shall we open it up for questions now?
Yeah.
Thank you both very much indeed for that. There's a lot of rich tips and information in your session, and I see that the chat was quite active as well, posing questions, and thank you, Anne-Marie, for helping out and answering some of the questions there. Just pulling together some of the questions, and thank you, Emery, for helping me out with that. I might start with two posed to you, Mikey and Sarah, and then we'll take it from there based on the time that we have remaining. So the first two questions are, how often should you aim to publish during your PhD? And then, how many articles and other papers should you aim to, those are two similar questions. So I suppose just combining the two questions that I see together is, do you have any tips for how often one should aim to publish during the course of their PhD?
Shall I go first? If that's, I mean, that's almost impossible to answer, but I think, I mean, the problem is now that if you want to go into an academic career after your PhD, having a PhD won't be enough. That's the realistic situation that we're in now. So I would think, I don't know, if you've got a case comment, you could look to be publishing a case comment, a book review, at least one article, I would think you'd be looking at, because other people will have that and other people will have more. But I saw one of the other questions then about balancing the time between, so I know that because it's also interwoven, it is hard to know, but I would expect somebody to have at least one of each of those three things, but I don't know whether other people think that's unrealistic.
Yeah, I broadly agree with you, Sara. I mean, the sad reality is it's a competitive field, and one way of helping to advance your career prospects, if you're interested in an academic career, of course, if you're not, it's going to be a very different discussion. But if you're interested in an academic career, you know, I think students should be thinking about ways in which they can turn aspects of their PhDs during the process of writing it into papers, at least one. I think that's absolutely right. There are other, as you said, other ways of getting perhaps more minor publications that shows that you're, you know, on top of the field and perhaps contributing to the academy in different kinds of ways. I think it is important to get the balance right. I mean, I think there is a point at which, and this is as much point of supervision, I think, as it is for students, but, you know, the thesis, I think, comes first. And it should come first, and there'll become a point where you might have to reasonably stop writing and write the thesis. Those two things can go hand in hand depending on how you write your thesis. So you may well be able to say, look, this chapter of the thesis looks like a paper. I might draft the initial version of that thesis chapter and the paper at the same time. Different style of writing, of course, but it's a way of trying to get two outputs from one single linked writing activity in that way. But I would emphasize the importance of thinking quite strategically early on in the PhD. You this is what I'm working on. This is where a contribution might be made. This is the kind of place where I might write something. This bit of my project might wait till I've finished the thesis. This bit might be able to be written whilst I'm doing my PhD. Those are really important conversations to have. Supervisor, I think, should have those with you. If they're not, I think it's very reasonable to put them forward yourself.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the reason why I suggested sort of book reviews and case commentaries, which I know obviously is legal, but it's because it's going back to your earlier point about visibility. It's getting yourself known, because that can be one of the issues as a sort of established academic. You don't know what anybody else is doing elsewhere. So, but if people are coming forward and saying, oh, I can write this book review for you, or I can do this, that's how you get, oh, that's interesting, that's going on there, and connections start to be built. And if those jobs are done well, then you start to think about people in different contexts. So it is a way of building up a reputation early on. But I also think you're right about PhD has to come first, because that's what you're there for. And it is hard to balance the time, but it is something that your supervisor should be able to discuss with you and support you with.
That's great advice. And Sarah, you probably remember my emails to you about book reviews for medical law review. It is a wonderful way to start to get your name out there and to read the literature in your field so that you can comment on it. I might go to Sara's question and comment. So she says, in terms of this writing process, what advice do you have for PhD researchers in their final years of their academic journey on strategies to balance time between publishing and the PhD? So as Sara writes, publishing does require time commitment, as both of you have shared. And while it is a massive benefit to the CV, it is a trade-off with ensuring you complete in 3 years to show that you can complete projects in a given time frame and making yourself a competitive applicant. And in that case, what strategies can you adopt to ensure that all the things that you publish are very strong pieces for visibility and match the expectations of where you would like to work? So I suppose a question about balance, and particularly thinking about towards the end stage of the 3 years roughly of the PhD and starting to get your name out there, how you try to do that while trying to achieve the 3-year timeline.
So I have a going first, and then Mikey can mop up all my many errors. Well, one thing I was just thinking about then was, I wonder if one thing you could do is, rather than publishing directly on your PhD, is maybe looking at something that's similar to it but sits to the side of it, that isn't covered in it. Because I'm just wondering about whether I'm just remembering back to my final years of doing a PhD, where you become so all consumed that I wonder if it makes sense to almost look at something slightly different to give yourself time off from your PhD, or might that confuse you more? I mean, it's so personal. It is a really, really, really tricky question to answer. Or is there something, I think Mikey said before, is there something in your PhD that you could take out? Or I don't mean like physically remove from, but draw on it, that you could develop in a slightly different way, because obviously PhD writing and academic writing is slightly different? Or have you actually written something that was going to go into your PhD but doesn't fit in? Because that's where I ended up. I ended up writing 120,000 words and I could only submit 100. So I had the 20,000 words left, and so was able then to publish that as an article. I mean, I don't know. It's really tricky. Mikey, help me out.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it's such a personal thing, the journey from the start of a PhD to the end of it. And different people will have different opportunities for publishing depending on the topic they're working on and the ways in which the kind of research they're doing as well. So there really isn't a single right answer, I don't think. I mean, I think respond, sorry, in the same way that I responded to the previous comment, that there are ways of not seeing them in competition, because there are opportunities to publish aspects of your thesis as you're writing it. I think depends a bit on the discipline, it depends a bit on the style of the thesis, but it's not uncommon that you can take a chapter of a PhD and say this is a distinctive part of the project that actually stands alone potentially as a paper, or with a bit of work can do so, and you can potentially write them in parallel in that way. You also can, of course, then say, if you get it published, at the top of that chapter, this has been peer reviewed and published in this journal in this place, and that's going to set you up very nicely for the viva. So do think quite imaginatively, I think, about as your thesis starts to take shape in the maybe second or third year, is there a component chapter or component couple of chapters that stand, you know, as potential papers in their own right, and could I adapt or write them alongside each other? If you think that would be something you could potentially do, and that's something I would potentially recommend.
Thank you both. And maybe one final question, which is about this engagement. Would you welcome, given you both are in capacity of being editors of journals, direct approaches from PhDs and early career researchers to write a case comment or a book review, or, you know, propose a topic for an original article? Do you welcome direct approaches from young academics?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think it's a bit different thing what you're approaching about. I mean, but people are always looking for book reviewers. People are always looking for paper reviewers as well. So, you know, put yourself forward, sign up to journals to make sure you're on the list of potential reviewers. This is good things to put on your CV. Yes, book reviews, you know, are and I'm a book reviews editor for a different journal at the moment. You know, you're constantly struggling to find people to review books. So if you're interested in doing that, reach out. People will be responsive. It is also absolutely quite viable to propose a paper or to send maybe the abstract to the editors. Now, you've got to be a little bit careful about that. I think it's not going. You're not going to get much substantive feedback other than, yeah, this is the kind of thing we'd welcome, and it's not going to influence the process that you then have to go through either. And I would probably recommend that you don't do that too frequently. I mean, I think your supervisor would be the place to go first. But if you're thinking about contributing through other kind of forms, then absolutely. You know, book reviews editors are normally named on the journal website. Get in touch with them. They will absolutely welcome an inquiry and a proposal for a book to review as well, maybe.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. So for the medical law review, the book review editor is Bev Clough, and for the case commentary, it's Rob Hayward. Absolutely contact them directly. And I smiled about the original paper bit, yeah, because if somebody, when we have had contact and we're really happy, but if someone sends us an abstract, then we're likely to say, yeah, send it in, we'll have a look at it. But so I sort of think, let's do it for the original. Don't ask my opinion, just send it in. If you've read all the guidance that we've got online, then just go for it. But yeah, with the book reviews and case commentaries, absolutely contact the people that will be listed on the website. And yeah, people definitely want. And also, if you do a book review on a book you're going to have to read anyway for your PhD, then you know you're sort of doing two things there. You're reading it with your PhD, but also reading it with a different reviewer's hat on. I think that can be a worthwhile exercise, can't it, Ted?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think that, you know, the key advice is be intrepid, speak with your supervisor for guidance and mentorship, as always anyway, speak with your colleagues, but take advantage of the time also in your PhD when you have, in some sense, the luxury of 3 years to focus solely on ideas and writing and research, because that does change, as maybe we'll talk about tomorrow, as you pursue an academic career and you're balancing administrative tasks and teaching tasks to get as much writing in as much experience as you can. So I think most editors would warmly welcome an approach to say, you know, are you happy if I review this book, or I have a pitch to review this book? And as Mikey and Sara say, maybe sometimes selectively reach out to pitch at a high level a topic proposal, and they can say it falls within the scope of the journal, so they'd welcome a submission. Yeah, absolutely be intrepid. I see that we're 3 minutes over time. I thank you very much for everyone's good patience today, and thank you, of course, to Mikey and Sara for this wonderful second session on writing and publishing research. It is so important, obviously, in the early stages of one's career, to get your name out there and to show that you are capable of undertaking original research and can have robust, rigorous ideas that the world should read about. So really valuable session. Thank you for that. Colleagues, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and most importantly, stay tuned for tomorrow and join us again at 10 a.m. to open. And we have 2 more sessions for tomorrow, one on writing grant applications, another core component of developing a career in bioethics and health law, and that will be led by Lucy Frith at Liverpool and Sara Chan at Edinburgh. And then a final session on career opportunities in bioethics and health law, Mary Guy, Lancaster, and Simon Woods at Newcastle. So stay tuned, please join us tomorrow. And once again, thank you very much, Mikey and Sara, and have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone. Take good care.
Thanks, Ted.